Hey there, IndyCar fans. This is Nathan Brown, your motorsports insider with the Indianapolis Star, here for episode 2 of the Inside Line, here with my co-host, Joey Barnes. We're here to talk this episode about the 11 teams that we have competing full-time here in IndyCar in 2025, and we'll break them all down for you, talk a little bit briefly maybe about some of the changes that they have all undergone, and then we'll lead the conversation with either what we think our biggest question is about these teams, or what we're most excited to see, what we are looking for as we think about the folks at Chip Ganassi Racing, Team Penske, etc., etc. Here, as I mentioned, my co-host on the Inside Line, Joey Barnes. Joey, we're here now just a little over a week as we're taping this from the IndyCar season starting. Kind of wild in some ways how quickly this offseason has gone in some way, but really excited to get this going and really intrigued to dive straight into the 11 teams, as we mentioned, and talk a little bit about each and every one of them before we get cars on track in St. Pete.
Yeah, man. Well, Nathan, it's always fun to be here, right? Like we get to talk racing, which is something we've been craving all off season, and it's starting to finally feel real. Like we're finally here counting days. We're not counting months. We're not trying to pretend that we've got to get past Christmas and New Year's and all that stuff. It's finally here. We can finally see the fruits of the labor of an off season of promotions with Fox that we touched on in the last episode. We can finally see the benefits to what's to come with new faces and new places, right? And new technical partners. And so I'm excited for this season. I'm excited what it can bring. And I guess with that, I've got to put you right out of the gate. We're going to put you on the spot. What are you looking at with Chip Ganassi Racing? Because we're just going to dive right into it, man.
Biggest thing, and I think it's no surprise, can Alex Palou win a third straight championship? He's won 3 of the last 4. When you're thinking about, who is my pick to win the championship this year, I used to do an exercise on IndyStar.com. I didn't do it last year and don't know that I plan to this year, where you kind of go in and predict the race winner of every single season and then kind of think about, big picture, who your championship pick is for the season. And I struggled with that in some ways. When you think about the championship pick, because a lot of times going into a season, there's like an obvious pick, and you just decide, do I go with the obvious choice? Do I kind of go against the grain and pick a dark horse? And it's just really hard to pick anyone other than Alex Palou to win this championship this year. When you see what he's done, only winning 2 races last year, which I don't think gets talked about enough. He didn't win a race past the middle of June. We hadn't even hit the halfway mark. And normally when you look at a championship in this sport, the driver that oftentimes ends up winning the championship is someone who gets hot at the end of the year. You oftentimes see over maybe the first 10 races or so, you have 2, 3, 4 guys that win 2 races or so, and then that closing stretch is about who can catch fire in July and August and early September and rattle off either a couple wins in a row or string together 3 or 4 podiums, and kind of edge out their competition. And Alex last year, though he was in a tight fight with Will Power down to the final race of the year, wasn't truly dominant in a way, really the way in which he was in 2023 when he won 5 races and he already had the title sealed before we got to the season finale. But he was just incredibly consistent. He had that run that stretched from 23 into 24 of top 8 finishes that was finally snapped. But we saw how Alex Palou responded to adversity when he spun at Iowa, and was a guy that didn't let that phase him. He had a solid end to the year, and it was his consistency that ultimately, his lack of mistakes, his lack of putting himself in a bad situation where other drivers' misfortunes or mistakes helped decide his season-long championship fate for him. And ultimately, that's what helped Alex win that third title in 4 years. It is a level of domination and success and consistency that we haven't seen in the sport, probably dating back to Dario Franchitti's first couple of years with Chip Ganassi Racing, where he won Indy 500s in 2010 and 2012 and won 3 straight championships in 2009, 10, and 11. Between that and when Alex kind of burst onto the scene, you're kind of alternating oftentimes back and forth between Scott Dixon winning a championship and the likes of Will Power, Joseph Newgarden, or Simon Pagenaud at Team Penske. And now for the first time, we've got someone who can win these back-to-back that we hadn't seen since Dario. And it will be really interesting to see if he can go 3 straight and what might come in that season. Does Alex win the 500 along with a championship? Does he win it with 2 races? Does he win it with 5 race wins? Is he able to do it? That's ultimately what this all boils down to.
The fact that you didn't say Scott Dixon infuriates me in any capacity, because I don't care what anybody looks at within last year's framework of points. His drive at Long Beach was one of the greatest drives that I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. Period. Full stop. And he's 6-time champion going for 7. There's so much within the framework of that team that looks the same, but there's so much that has changed, right? They have a technical alliance with MSR, which we can get into a little bit later, and with Meyershank Racing, and they've got this Indy Next team now that they haven't had an Indy Next team in 15, 18 years, something like that. Back when before it was even known as Indy Lights, I think. And so there's a lot of interesting resource development changes within that organization that I'm curious about. But equally, maybe this is just me being a captivator or prisoner of the moment, I should say. And I'm fascinated to see and curious to see when, not if, but when Dixon just says, like, screw this, I'm pushing. Like, I'm not going to get kicked around by Alex Palou. I'm taking this to the next level. I'm taking my game to the next level. We're not going to have some weird miscue at Mid-Ohio with the mechanical issue. We're not going to have all these other things because, it wasn't that long ago that we were wondering if, him and Joseph, since Joseph came into the sport head-to-head, they've got the same number of championships. Is Joseph about to overtake him? And then he just buried that talk instantly by going out there and winning the next 2 titles, I think, or 2 of the next 3. I forget off the top of my head. And you look at this and you're just like, at what point does Dixon come out and he raises his game and he hits on a top level? So to me, I understand, because Alex Palou has been so good, and I take nothing away from how good he is, because he is easily a generational talent in this sport, especially in the short 5 years that he's been here. I'm just waiting for, I guess, the head honcho or the chief, or who we look at as the leader of that series, to be like, you know what? Okay, cool. This has been fun. It's been a good run for you. It's time for me to take control of this and go get number 7 and tie AJ Foyt.
I would love nothing more than to see the drama unfold if Scott Dixon is truly in a championship fight going into the last 3 or 4 races, especially if it was with Alex Palou. That's something that's kind of been missing these last couple of years. Dixon was a good ways out of it last year. He was the closest person to Palou in 2023, and even still, Palou clinched that title before we got to the final race of the year. And then, since Scott won his last title in 2020, was kind of, on the fringe in 21 and 22, but I think was still, if memory serves me right, finishing 3rd or 4th or so in the championship. As we got into the final race, wasn't maybe the most likely challenger to making a run for it. And I would be so curious to see, what is a Scott Dixon that enters the last 3 races of the year, either as the points leader or as, say he's within 10, 15 points, a gap that is very, very doable. And what kind of fire, what kind of focus, what kind of execution we see out of him, because even though he's won a handful of races since that last title in 2020, we haven't, I don't feel like, gotten down to the end of a season and felt like Scott Dixon was the driving force in a championship conversation. And I do hope that we get that. And I think this could be a perfect year for that. And there'd be nothing cooler than to see how things would be in that CGR shop and those team meetings if you truly had kind of a winner take all situation in Nashville Super Speedway with Polo and Dixon going down the stretch for a title in the last race of the year. That'd be pretty cool.
Yeah.
We'll move on to our second team. What the team that we, I think, probably both expect to be the biggest challengers to Chip Ganassi Racing for that championship in 2025, Team Penske. What would you say is your biggest question for that program as we get into this IndyCar season?
Is it subtraction by addition? And how I mean that is, for a long time now, they've run three competitive cars. I think it's interesting to look at the framework of the way the last few championships have played out, and the fact that, like, I understand that Chip Ganassi had 5 cars last year, and with respect to Kiffin Simpson coming in as a third driver at CGR, we're expecting him to just continue his development. We're not necessarily expecting him to be a perennial podium contender, title contender, et cetera. We expect him to continue his development, though, and shine in certain places. But they've got 2 cars at Chip Ganassi that everyone looks at as true title contenders. And you look at Penske and it's 3. Are they taking points away from each other? And that's what I mean by subtraction by addition. Are they actually subtracting points off themselves by the fact that they've got 3 title contenders instead of 2? Because you look at this past year, or last year, I should say, this past year, that's a pure Southern talk there. But, it's not lost on me. And I wrote this story back in October that, Scott McLaughlin would have actually won the championship via tiebreaker by wins if the push to pass scandal never happened. If those penalty points were not in a situation, this would have been Scott McLaughlin's championship, which is amazing to think about considering where he came from, the learning curve, et cetera. So I think to that end, do we run into a situation where they stop Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg each other, and that there's actually a clear cut, like, this is our guy to go fight this title because we recognize that Alex Palou's got to be caught. And, like, let's not assume that this is 2024 Alex Palou. Let's assume for a second this is 2023. Somebody has got to come with a massive challenge to him, and they've got to mount it. And that's going to take a collective team effort, not a solo effort with somebody just going off an enigmatic run like a Pato Award per se, and going off and just rattling off great finishes. This would have to be a collective effort on Penske's part to literally say, we're not going to continue to let this guy push us around. We're going to be the rolling chicane on the racetrack while one guy's leading, the other guy is kind of holding serve to be the annoying person, because it's hard to pass in IndyCar. So we're going to make sure we're going to make that rear wing as wide as possible. So, and to that, I think the other question, before I hand it over to you, is a trio of questions, really, is what version of Joseph Newgarden do we get? Do we get the consistent Joseph Newgarden who is very much capable of being a championship contender and winning at all disciplines? Or do we just get the Joseph that's focused on the 500 and that makes or breaks his season? I think that's an important question. Is this the year that I think that it's fair to say that we expect a continued growth out of Scotty McLaughlin. I think he's shown over time with 2 third-place finishes and points, consistency all around, really, and learning what he needs out of this car. And also keep in mind, one of the few drivers that have actually won in the hybrid era of IndyCar racing, which is not something many can say. And he did it in a really great way at Milwaukee, keep in mind, and Iowa for that matter. does we expect him to take that next step? What does that next step look like? And the other is, with Will, like there's this weird interpretation that, and I don't know this to be true because I haven't been told this, but there's this growing thought that, Penske made sure David Malukas was in the fold because we don't know necessarily the framework of things within Miles Rowe's development. We don't know the nature of things within how long Will wants to stay in IndyCar and be at the top level. And so there's all these interesting things in play that at least give Penske options. Screw that. I don't want to hear that. I want to hear Will Power, 2-time champion, Indy 500 champion, stepping up and doing what we all know he's capable of, because whether this is probably a terrible thing, the thing that I crave the most, and I know I've asked this about Will and Will Power and Scott Dixon many a time, the thing that I crave the most is I want to see the Scott Dixon versus Will Power mano-a-mano matchup for the ages where they're sparring on a racetrack and it's just them. I could watch that forever. It's like what we saw with Pato and Pelot last year at Mid-Ohio. I want to see that. Can we get that version of Will back? Where maybe there's not the subtle mistakes of seatbelt issues, because he was a title contender until the season finale, but did we really view him seriously as that? And so I think all those are kind of questions I have. And so with that, I know I didn't leave you too much time here on our little segment touching on Penske, but those are the trio of questions I have facing that entire organization.
Yeah. I mean, you made a great point there. The thing that really stuck with me, the fact that, after Alex Palou and Chip Ganassi Racing's last win of the year, you still had 9 races left to go following Laguna Seca. All 3 Team Penske drivers won at least 1 race during that span. None of them won more than 2. If you have a span of the year where Alex Palou is going to go 9 races without winning, and he's still going to walk away with the championship while having finishes of 23rd, 19th, and 11th. If you would have told me, I think if you would have told both of us at Laguna Seca, Alex isn't going to win a race the rest of the year, and he's going to have 3 finishes outside the top 10, I think I would have said without question, Alex Palou is not winning this championship.
Gateway was the example, right?
Yep. Yeah. He goes through and doesn't have a great race and still finishes 4th. That's a Team Penske team that overall was the strongest to end the season, but did not have any one driver that was at a level that was able to rise above the rest. I know we don't really want to get into the F1 world of A driver and B driver across a whole season, but I think at some point, if you're Team Penske and you're going to go after Scott Dixon or going to go after Alex Palou, whichever one of them has the upper hand as we get to the halfway point in the season, you've got to put all your eggs in one basket. You've got to identify the driver that is performing the best, and your drivers have to be on board with that. You can't have a situation like we saw in Toronto where Will Power and Scott McLaughlin are jockeying for 4th place or whatever it was, 3rd or 4th place, something in the top 5, and end up ruining both their days. That race as well, along with the push to pass incident and dilemma, I think had a big impact on this championship as well. So we'll see if this Team Penske team, who's only won 2 of the last 7 championships, I think, if they have what it takes to go up against this Chip Ganassi Racing duo.
Is it wrong of us, before we move on real quick, I got to ask this of you, is it wrong of us to automatically just, because the way that you said that kind of interprets this, and so I want to make sure I got the framework of this right. Does it bad on us to automatically think whichever one has the upper hand this season, and you said Alex Palou, Scott Dixon, almost making it sound like we completely expect one of them to be at the number 1 spot in the point standings after, say, 8 of 17 rounds, and not necessarily anyone else? Like,
I guess I wouldn't go that far to say that I think it's a foregone conclusion. I think there's a lot of people that could be in that spot. Any one of those 3 Team Penske drivers could. I think Pato O'Ward could. I think Colton Herta could. Yeah. And at that point, you're at 7 drivers. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. I just think that those 2 guys are the. If you're looking outside Team Penske, who do you think has the best chance of leading the points after, at the halfway point? I think it'd be I feel like it's probably those two, although I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't.
Not fair. No, I just wanted to make sure I got that right because I was like, oh, where's it going with this? So one of the teams that we definitely have to touch on, and hopefully we'll try not to get too long-winded about, but we're very guilty of being long-winded, both of us. But Andretti Autosport, or Andretti Global, sorry, 2017, sorry, but Andretti Global has had a lot of change. The driver lineup is the same, but everything else is different, really, within the infrastructure of that team. So, what is the biggest question that you look at? What's the biggest question mark you look at when you see that team going into 2025?
I think it is how does Colton Herta respond to the pressure, whether he likes to admit it or not? How does he respond to the internal, external pressures of being on the cusp of a Formula One seat? Now, no one really outside of Mario Andretti in terms of the leadership of this organization. Mario Andretti now a board member of the Cadillac F1 team that is in a convoluted way, involved with Andretti Global. I know it doesn't have Andretti in the name, but they are owned by the same parent company, ultimately Mark Walter and Dan Towers, and the several versions of the motorsport entities that they now look over and run. How does Colton respond to this potential opportunity that I think we all assume is there for him to take one of these two Cadillac F1 seats as this team looks to launch in 2026? Now, it's not an automatic thing, as I referenced there. Colton has to finish, I believe, fourth or better in the championship to earn enough super license points to qualify for a race seat in 2026 without factoring in, could he go and run a handful of FP1 sessions? Now, I think he could finish fifth and maybe only need one or two of those. That seems like a thing that could be struck potentially, if he runs maybe one with McLaren and one with someone else, what have you. But whether Colton likes to admit it or not, I think this is a very real opportunity on the table for him. And it's not something that's automatic. It's going to take another one of these seasons like we saw last year, where he wins 2 or 3 races, where he's qualifying well, where he's minimizing mistakes, where he, in a race weekend that maybe isn't his best, that he is still managing to log top 5s, top 7s, top 10s at the very least. Yes, last year he was better at that. Ultimately, didn't have enough of those to really put on a solid championship march toward the end of the season. He won his 3rd race of the year, his first oval win of the year at Nashville Superspeedway to cap off the 2024 campaign. But this was all a big topic of discussion a couple years ago, where Colton felt like he was kind of on the precipice of a Formula One opportunity with the greater Red Bull organization before that kind of fell through. And there were a couple of years there where, coincidence or not, the F1 thing was a big deal, maybe for those outside of Colton's inner circle. And he finished 9th or 10th in the championship and kind of fell, took a step back, wasn't a driver that you were maybe thinking over the last couple of years when you entered into the season that was an odds-on championship contender. Now he proved he is very much part of that mix nowadays with what he did last year and how he closed out the year. But that's a major opportunity for someone who went as he was a teenager, moved to Europe, lived by himself, and dove headfirst into that junior Formula ladder system with Formula One as the ultimate goal. Obviously, not something that panned out for him at the time, and he made his way back to Indy Lights and ultimately IndyCar, and has carved out an incredible start to a career for himself. But I think anyone at his age, particularly someone who raced in Europe, would say if they had the opportunity to race in Formula One, they would take it. And this may very well be the last opportunity for him. There, I'm sure, have probably already been internal discussions on where the team goes if that is indeed a possibility. He would seem like a great person to put in that seat as an American driver for this American team, and someone who's very familiar with that team and that brand, and who's kind of been along for the ride for this. So I'm really interested to see how Colton responds to all of this external noise, even as he tries to tune it out and tell us in content days that he's not really focused on it. He's not thinking about it. He allegedly didn't even know where he had to finish in the championship to ensure that that super license. So all eyes focused on Colton and his F1 pursuits and this Andretti global conglomerate at large as it gets ready to join the F1 world in 2026 as well.
I actually believe Colton, by the way, when he says he didn't know where he needs to finish, because
I agree.
He's only focused on winning, right?
I know he's one of the very few drivers that if they told me that, I actually would believe them. I mean, you have to be a little bit quirky, I think, to really excel, not only in motorsports, but in life and as an athlete. I think you have to have that like really truly singular focus that helps drive your performance and ultimately allow you to just be focused on things that matter and not focus on the things that don't. But once we get there and as we get closer, there are going to have to be conversations about where things are, and there's going to start to be noise, and there's going to be stories, there's going to be questions asked, and that's going to be a tougher thing to block out if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this in twofold. One, I think when you have a brand like Cadillac involved on an F1 scale, I think that if Cadillac went to the FIA and said, "This is our guy, what do we need to do?" I think that there's probably some sort of exemptions that could be made, to be fair. Like, I think if he finishes sixth in the championship, for instance, I'm sure there's a way, right? I mean,
you're probably right.
Grease some palms or whatever. Like, I don't know, but I know that sounds shady as heck to say, but.
Well, I mean, I think we all know how that story seemed like it flipped on its head in the 6 weeks or so between Michael Andretti stepping down and that team mysteriously all of a sudden just landing an F1 opportunity out of the blue. And it seemed like they were the enemies of the state from a Liberty Media standpoint. So,
yeah, no, but to put it on the IndyCar side, here's what I'm going to say real quick before moving on is I would expect Colton to continue to be in this return to form, because this is exactly what we saw back in, I think it was 2021, if I recall, that he finished third in points.
Correct.
And then had 2 down years. So this is what we expected. Having said that, the thing that I'm concerned about, all this change, is it going to be a positive for the team or a negative with the team? Mm-hmm. Because last year, let's keep in mind, Colton was the only one that won for that organization. Kyle Kirkwood, we know, fully capable, one of the best shoes, can put it on rails and go win you a race. One of the most talented drivers on the grid. Marcus Ericsson, former F1 driver, wins an Indy 500, arguably should be a 2-time winner. And, you know, you look at this and you go, we expect him to return to form, because he even admits, like, I examined my own craft. I saw where my mistakes were. He's already, I mean, he's one of the best self-examiners within himself, of his own framework within the series that we have. And I fully expect him to step his game up. So, but is that organization going to step up collectively, or is it only going to allow one driver to step up? Because if you only have one driver winning, with respect, it's Arrow McLaren at that point. You are literally the same as Arrow McLaren, because you have one driver that is the face of that, and you're moving forward. And this organization at one point was able to put 3 title contenders in the top 5. Like, this was an organization that was the only challenger to the Penske's and the Ganassis. It's the only one that's broken up the monotony of the last 20 years. So, you know, with that in perspective, I'm expecting a collective step up. I expect each one of those drivers to fight for wins. I actually expect this to be, because of the hybrid, because of what it is, and I guess this is just a teaser for later, but I'll spoil it now, is I expect this to be the most diverse season of winners that we've ever had. I expect Scott Dixon, Alex Palou, Kyle Kirkwood, Marcus Ericsson, Will Power, Colton Hurd. I expect literally several drivers to have one win. And I expect a situation where maybe the champion only has 2 wins or 3 wins, but they've got, maybe 11 podiums or 9 podiums or something obnoxious. But I still expect the number of drivers to hit victory lane to be completely different, because I think that this is how close the field is. And I think part of that's because of the new low voltage hybrid. But all things in perspective, that's the biggest thing that I'm kind of wondering is are they going to get back to their form collectively, or are they going to just be what they were again?
Yeah. Next team, we'll move on to Arrow McLaren, team that's been that was in the news a boatload last year. A team who I think is hoping to issue as few press releases as humanly possible as they turn a new leaf and hopefully have a driver lineup, if nothing else, that is stable for this year and years into the future. What do you, when you look at that team and how it's changed, not only from a driver perspective in 2024, but a leadership perspective, as we touched on in the last episode, what's your biggest question mark for that organization moving into 2025?
It's kind of piggybacking off of the last episode we did, which is, are they going to break the glass ceiling? Like, very simply put, are they going to actually be that team to finally do everything that we believe they're capable of doing? Are they going to capitalize on every finish? Are they going to capitalize on every result? Or are they going to continue to have these random mechanical issues or these random pit issues?
Or just a weekend where they're just like flat out not competitive. You don't see that out of a Team Penske. You don't see that out of Ganassi. And they just had some weekends over the last couple of years where they just were out to lunch from the very beginning, and they've really struggled to develop and pick up spots over a weekend. And I think that's been one of the things that's really held them back the most.
100%. And, and to that end, I mean, it's the centered question that has a trickle-down effect, like a pyramid scheme, which is, can Pato Award not have as many, like, are his low days still top 10 finishes instead of a mechanical issue that puts him 25th, or having one of those mental blunder weekends like we saw at Barber last year where he was hitting everything in sight? Can Christian Lundgaard adapt his craft to the ovals to where he's maybe the surprise championship contender we didn't know we had, and he actually shows the true potential of everything that Arrow McLaren can demonstrate? And then we expect Nolan Siegel to continue his development, and he was on play for a podium at Gateway, to be completely fair to him. Can he continue that growth in a similar vein? But what does this team look like without Gavin Award now? What does this team look like under kind of a counseled leadership collectively that we all kind of view as led by Tony Kanaan? And, because as it's been told to you and I both in that fun impromptu Zoom call, Tony Kanaan is an extension of Zach Brown on the IndyCar side. It's completely an extension. So what does that extension look like? Because if we didn't have that extension the last 2 years, then what does that look like moving forward? Is it an extension that takes this team to a caliber that we've seen on the F1 side? Because that's a very lethal team on the F1 side that can do some very special things. And if that's the case, then we're in store for something that could be electric in 2025, that could literally take the fight in a proper way to the Ganassis and the Penskes, and honestly put themselves firmly in the hierarchy of the top 3. Like, it's been the big 3 for a long time because of Andretti, but realistically speaking, this is that kind of interesting year where you look at it and you're like, if McLaren do what they do, even if Andretti finishes second in points, but if Arrow McLaren have more wins, if they're literally more lethal in the podium fight, if they're doing more things with their lineup, and I think it's fair to say that it's a lesser lineup than Andretti, right? I mean, collectively speaking, that's a hell of a statement. So to me, that's kind of the question.
Agreed. It's if memory serves me right, McLaren's F1 team had a massive leadership shakeup leading into the 2023 season, and by 2024, by early 2024, they are clear-cut constructors championship contenders, and ultimately pull that out. Do we see a similar just leap taken from this team? I think it's definitely possible, but time will tell. The team that I feel like, once we get outside that top four, that I think has the biggest potential to fight up there toward the front of the grid is Meyer Shank Racing. So that's the team I'm going to go to next. And the question I have for that organization is, I felt like as strong as the 2024 season started, I feel like it really kind of sputtered out with the ways in which particularly Felix, who was obviously the team's lone full season driver last year, ended. He had a handful of rough results, some of which were his mistakes or the team's mistakes, some of which was just mechanical bad luck. And yes, maybe sometimes things that you can guard for, but ultimately things that I don't feel like showed that team's true on track potential. We've seen them on podiums, we've seen them on poles, we've seen them consistently out front and challenging for race win contention multiple times over the first chunk of last year. Is this team going to, what I feel like, reach its full potential and win a race this season? That's the question I have. And the reason I think it's possible is because they go from a technical alliance with what we would probably argue is the third strongest organization in the series to, I think, one that either you would say is first or second, a team at Chip Ganassi Racing, where they now have a technical alliance that has won 3 of the last 4 championships. You now have a debrief room that will include Alex Palou, Scott Dixon, and Felix Rosenquist, along with Marcus Armstrong and Kevin Simpson. I think that those first 3 guys, though they are not teammates necessarily, I mean, that's a hell of a 3-driver team. Felix talked about spending a lot of time either at the Chip Ganassi Racing shop this offseason or with his new engineer and the folks from CGR that will be helping out on that crew. And I'm really excited to see what this MSR team can do with this new relationship that I think leaves them only with the potential of being stronger. I think they have the potential last year, if things really truly fell the right way for them, had some good luck that they could have won a race. I think by the end of 25, if they don't win a race, I think that team will feel disappointed.
Yeah, I would completely agree on every facet. And I think for me, I look at that and I go, okay, Felix is back home, right? He's back in the debriefs of Ganassi where he won his one and only race with at Road America, beating his best friend Pato, and back in 2020. And I look at this, though, and kind of wonder, and I think the 2 questions that stand out to me, and this isn't necessarily anything that needs response unless you care to, but it's, did Meyer Shank Racing maximize their partnership with Andretti? And then 2, is Felix the best driver among the non-Power 4 to be a dark horse in the title conversation? Like I expect Marcus Armstrong to go grab a podium and to do some good things. I think we're all hoping to some degree that there's some dark horse from one of these mid-tier teams that can kind of shake it up and make it interesting. And we all see Felix's pace and we think, man, this could get fun. If he can actually convert his qualifying results to finishing results and not qualify on pole and finish 4th or qualify 5th and finish 10th, but actually do maybe even the reverse of it, it could be a very interesting season with somebody like that in play.
Agreed. I mean, you look at what he did on track before we got to the 500 last year. 5th at St. Pete, 3rd place at the non-points paying thermal race, a 9th from pole at Long Beach, 4th at Barber, and 10th at the IMS road course. I think you would argue, he might tell us if we asked him, You look at what he did there over that stretch of his first 5 times on track last season, and the speed that team showed in practice and qualifying. I think you have a pretty strong argument that was even a little bit disappointing given what we saw over the course of those race weekends. The fact that they only had 1 podium, I think, was almost a little surprising. And the fact that he finished 9th off of a pole at Long Beach kind of speaks to that in some way, exactly what you were saying. So really interested to see how this team shakes out. Another team kind of in a similar vein, although not changing its technical alliance in 2025, a team at AJ Foyt Racing that I think has aspirations of winning races and logging podiums and taking another big step in potentially pacing this midfield group that we have in IndyCar. When you look at that team, what's the first thing that stands out?
Can this team overcome the adversity of an offseason, a plethora of offseason changes? I mean, it's not just the fact that their alliance with Penske has seen some sort of shakeup because Tim Cindric is no longer necessarily in the same role, although he's still heavily involved, obviously, but it's a different dynamic, right? And then I think, how does that play into that technical alliance? But I think also Stingray Robb is gone. David Malukas enters the chat. How does he challenge Santino? How does his future within the landscape? Because it's not necessarily like, we all know that he was kind of tabbed in a situation that could put him in framework for a Penske seat. Now, we don't want to hear it. We don't necessarily enjoy necessarily thinking that everything is automatic, because it also leaves out the fun. But Michael Cannon's also gone. Like, there's just, and this team has moved from having 2 bases, one in Texas, like 3 hours from my house on Waller, and now out by Houston, and then you've got the one up in Indy, and now they've diverted everything to Indianapolis. There's a lot of change in the fabric of that team in just a few months. What does that look like? And Santino is not working with an ex-Penske engineer. The ex-Penske engineer, or not ex-Penske, he's still current Penske. The Penske engineer is Malukas's guy now. It's not Santino's guy. That kind of already puts him on the back foot because he built a relationship now. So now he's having to learn his 3rd engineer in 3 seasons with this organization. And, Malukas has got a little bit more movement in his wrist after some scar tissue removal over the offseason, which is good. So there's some positives there. And man,
who do you think, when it's all said and done, ultimately finishes higher in the championship between those two?
That's the thing. I mean, right? Like, I don't know. I don't even know how to answer that question, because I look at that and I can make arguments for both. I mean, I could tell you this. I would be hard pressed to say, what if David Malukas finishes higher in the championship by, say, 2 spots, right? Let's give him 2 spots. But what if Santino's that guy that brings you an Indy 500? I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility either, based on what we've seen. But I'm very fascinated to see how that team can continue its progress given the change. That's the biggest question mark for me, is you've endured all these changes. How can you maintain to at least be on the same level of what we probably expect, which is a Meyer Shank Racing? Like, how can you, because they punched above their weight last year by our standards, right? Mm-hmm. Pole in Portland, all these finishes that Santino delivered. And then we started to look at it and go, okay, well, that second car is not doing as much. Now there's no excuses. Like, even with all of these changes, there's now an expectation. How do you work within the fabric? I'm saying that word a lot. How do you work within the play style of your team now that results are expected of you and it's not a surprise?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big part of the sport is when things are so tight, from drivers to teams, what have you, from a competition standpoint. When you take a step, how can you continue that progression from, finishing 9th in the championship like Ferrucci did? How do you build upon that? How do you make it not seem like once we finish 2025, like 2024 was an anomaly? How, as there are some teams in the paddock that over these last couple of years, I don't know that they've necessarily gotten worse, but other teams have surpassed them from a development standpoint, from a performance standpoint on the folks that they've hired behind the scenes, from their systems and the way in which they go about things, both on the track and off the track, at race weekends and back in the shop. And so I think as what you were alluding to there, can this team actually be even better than they were last year? I don't know. It's going to be really tough to imagine when you think of the folks who are ahead of them at the moment. I mean, I think on paper, you would probably assume all three Team Penske drivers are going to finish ahead of whoever the top Foyt driver is. Probably at least two Andretti drivers, at least one Aero McLaren driver, two Ganassi drivers. So if I'm doing my quick math there, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 guys before you even think about a Foyt driver. And then you've got Felix, and you've also got Lundgaard, and you've also got maybe a dark horse in Alexander Rossi. Like and your teammate that we're not even talking about. Like it's going to take an incredible effort just to replicate what they did what they did last year. And that's a really hard thing to do in the sport, is to stay where you are and make the improvements that allow you to be there when folks around you are doing the same.
Yeah, no, 100%. And with that though, just to make sure, that's something that remains to be seen, and we're going to find out. Santino certainly thinks they're a championship contender. He thinks himself a challenger, and you know what? I love it. I love the confidence. I love the panache. I love the ability to say, you know what? We're going to do something magical, and we don't give a crap what you think. We need that personality, to be blunt. But with that though, moving on down the line here, you hinted at Alexander Rossi. He's got a new home. He's no longer at Aero McLaren. He's at ECR, and Ed Carpenter Racing is next on our list. What do you see out of ECR?
Can this team, led by Alexander Rossi and Ed Carpenter, can they be legitimate contenders for a 500 win when we come to May? Rinus and Ed have flirted around that for the several years that Rinus had been part of that team. Ultimately, had never come through, but Rinus had proven that car has, annual speed again and again and again when it comes to qualifying. He's been, I don't have the exact results on me, but he'd been in the top 4, top 5, I think, just about every single time.
He's qualified 3 out of the front row 3 out of 5 years.
There we go. That's the stat I was looking for. I'm glad you had it square in your brain. That car undoubtedly has speed. There have been times that Rinus has been, around the front of that race once we hit the halfway point, but then whether it be his fault or the fault of someone else,
the pit road miscue against Alex. That comes.
Yeah, I mean, they have found ways over the last couple of years to, once we get to lap 170 and push comes to shove, to not really be in the picture anymore. When you have, you look at Alexander Rossi's resume at the 500, that's someone who, without the exact results in front of me, I mean, he, way more often than not, even if he doesn't qualify well, finds a way to be up around the front once we get down the closing stretch fairly often. Last year was the case, although I don't know that he ultimately had the speed to factor into the those last couple laps of battling between Joseph and Pato. I don't know that anyone had the speed to match Joseph when it really truly came down to it. But really excited to see what that duo in particular, along with Christian Rasmussen, who looked really racy at times in the 500 in his debut in 2024, what kind of a splash they can make, and if they can be someone that's right around that top 5 or so with 30 laps to go, and we really start to see who's going to win our 2025 Indy 500. I think that would be super cool. Alexander Rossi is a driver who's already won this race and would be looking for win number 2, and an Ed Carpenter who is a fan favorite around the Indy area, and someone who's been around the sport a long time and has been really close a couple times at winning a 500, including a string of poles and a runner-up finish in 2018. I think that'd be super exciting to see an ECR car, especially if it was Ed, out there at the front once we get to the closing laps in May. So we'll see if they can make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like maybe I'm interpreting this wrong. You tell me if I am, but it almost sounds like the way that you described that maybe Rossi is the missing link to turn that team from qualifying speed to race speed.
Yeah, and race speed and race execution too.
There you go. I think that's a key word.
Yeah, he's not someone who's going to go out there. You'd be really surprised to see him make a mistake on track. That's just not his MO. And Renus, for as much speed as he has and his strengths, he's someone that whether it was in May or not, if you were to see him spin or knock wheels with someone and take himself out of a solid spot in a race, you wouldn't have maybe been all that surprised these last couple of years. So really excited to see if Alex can, take the momentum that he was building, particularly over these last couple of years with Aaron McLaren in the 500 and take that over to ECR and see if they might have a breakthrough.
Yeah.
Another team that we're looking at once we get to May, maybe for some different reasons. Rahal Letterman Lanigan Racing, a team that's really been very up and down. The highs of winning a race in Toronto in 2023 with Christian Lundgaard, and the low of lows with Graham Rahal missing the race, the 500 that year, and nearly missing the race again here in 2024. Been a lot of change at that team between two brand new drivers alongside veteran Graham Rahal, along with another engineering overhaul that they've gone through this offseason. What's the biggest burning question that you have as you look at RLL entering 2025?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the more I look at this is, this feels like I can't tell if this is an actual changing of the guard or if we're just repeating history, because it was only 3 years ago that it looked like we were having a youth movement at RLL, that Christian Lundgaard was the future face of that organization, and everything was kind of getting geared towards that and kind of phasing Graham to more of a secondary role, right? I can't tell if that's the case or not right now. Like, I'm very high. Let me stress this, because I think that it's very important to express the fact that Louis Foster is a mega talent. I look at him, and maybe I'm going to get bashed for saying this. I don't really give a crap, but I look at him and I immediately see willpower. I see a guy who's capable of just extracting the most outright insane pace out of a car on any given day, on any given lap. And he has every capability to do that. And, can he show that at RLL? I don't know. But I do think that the road and streets, and even if we get mixed conditions in certain races, are going to show that his talent's going to shine through that, because that's where mechanical doesn't match. Mechanical grip and aero grip doesn't really matter much in rain races as much. It still matters. But, to hear what Graham said on media day about Devlin, reaching out to him and saying, like, hey, he was immediately texting me saying, hey, how do I get better? Like, I appreciate that. Like, I think it's important to notice that. I know Devlin is someone that maybe people are quick to discount because they saw what they saw at Andretti. And I mean, that was at a time when Andretti's lineup was just absolutely ridiculous, right? And I appreciate the fact that you've got a guy who is gone for a year, finds his way back, and is immediately pressing one of the veterans of this paddock, probably the most veteran driver short of Scott Dixon and Will Power that we have.
Mm-hmm.
And just picking his brain constantly. How do I get better? I'm studying tape. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. Like, help me learn this and this and this and this and this. And just the humility of that, I think, is something to be recognized. And, he understands where he has stood for several years, obviously, because if he didn't, he wouldn't have done that. So it really is this the year that this is the changing of the guard? There's been engineering changes. There's been all these other different things. Does Graham have a few flashes of a return to form. I mean, it honestly, maybe this is, I don't know if he's listening to this and is going to get mad about it, but I don't feel like the psyche has been the same since that Indy 500 that the wheel literally fell off, because he was so close. And we all know that in 2021, if that wheel doesn't fall off, like that's a wrap from lap 120 on.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate that for him. And I'm curious if any element of that still plays into the psyche. So because like there's been flashes of it, of good finishes, but there hasn't been the consistency, the continuity. And honestly, it's kind of been the framework of that since we've moved from the manufacturer aerokit era to the universal aerokit era. So can they finally adapt to this? Does the hybrid help discount that? Because I think that's another thing. Devlin hasn't dealt with the hybrid. Louis hasn't dealt with the hybrid. Graham's only had half a season, like everyone, of the hybrid. So, does that also help the shortcomings? It's going to be real tough. That's probably my biggest thing.
Yep. Among the three teams we have left here before we finish up, I think the team that I am most intrigued by, and I think there's a lot of reasons for that, is our newcomer on the grid, Prema Racing, who I imagine most of you kind of know their story, but really briefly, they have been an incredibly dominant junior Formula team over in Europe in a plethora of series that they have competed in over the years, dating back to the 80s. They've won dozens of championships at all different levels, and I think it's something like half of the current Formula One grid spent some time with Prema. That's the type of organization that we're talking about here. My question for them is, are they able to be competitive with some of these teams that we have just mentioned? And I don't think anyone expects them to go out and win races and probably even stand on a podium this year, but can they be in the top 10, top 12 occasionally? Are they, do they have a solid engineering direction? I know we've heard a lot about how they've brought folks from all across the motorsports landscape, from F1, IndyCar, sports cars, WEC, their junior Formula folks. So they've got theoretically a lot of different perspectives as they have started this IndyCar journey and built this team from the ground up with two young drivers that I think folks in motorsports think a lot of, between Callum Ilott and Robert Schwartzman. But with as competitive as this IndyCar series is nowadays, and with as long as most of the teams have been involved full time, and as deep of lineups as teams have, from engineering to mechanics to crew chiefs, etc., is it possible in this day and age to go from not even being in IndyCar to having a 2-car full-time program and being reasonably competitive? You could tell me that this team has 2 cars inside the top 17 at St. Pete, and I think that is just as possible as having 2 cars outside the top 20. I think the drivers have the talent. I think there are flashes of speed that we've seen in early testing, though I am number one on the board of not making a big deal about testing times. But I think the margin of error is so razor thin in this sport that I think it's really hard to tell where they are going to be once we get to the closing stretch of, say, races at Portland, and some of the ovals that we end with. Ovals are obviously the biggest question for them. I'm not going to make too much of what their oval performance is this year, but I'm really curious to see how they perform on road and street courses, because this team has a great pedigree on those types of tracks that we see in Europe, though it's a little bit different here. What are they ultimately in year one? I think they are the toughest team to predict on this grid, because I see a really wide range of results.
Just real quick, I know we got to move on. I know where we are on the clock, but just out of curiosity, is it alarming to you, because you talk about their oval program, and we know that they had an opportunity to keep and hold on to a very good oval setup guy in Michael Cannon, who left Foyt, went to Prema, and is now TBD, I believe. I don't completely know.
I've heard he's got a pretty long gardening leave clause in his contract. I don't exactly know the specifics, but I certainly don't expect to see him all of a sudden popping up on a timing stand at St. Pete. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess the question is this, though, is like, is that damning to you in some way when a guy leaves an organization like AJ Foyt Racing, goes to Prema, and did he even last 4 weeks?
Oh, I was under the impression that he might not have formally started until the first week of January, and I think he was gone within like 2 weeks.
Yeah, that's so. Yeah, I'm weary about stuff like that, because that tells me like
there were some wires crossed there. There was clearly wholly different sets of expectations from Cannon and the Prema leadership team in terms of what that role was going to be, kind of from what I understand.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, it's just, it's one of those situations where it's like, hey, we run our team this way and we're expecting this, and this is your role. And maybe that's different than anywhere that Michael Cannon has been. But it definitely speaks to, maybe their level of expectations within their framework of themselves, and to fair play to them, because as you said, I don't want to put too much on testing times either, but they tested well at Thermal, the abysmal club track that is in Palm Springs, or just outside of Palm Springs, that I absolutely can't stand and will not be apologetic about it. And then you have this run at Sebring, that they've looked pretty competent at too. So they're very much, even with not knowing a hybrid, Callum wasn't part of the hybrid era in any capacity. And a rookie second driver, there's so many elements of that they don't know, but yet they're very competent.
Yeah, agreed. Go on to one of our last teams here on the grid, Juncos Hollinger Racing. As you look at this team that we hinted at last episode, a lot of unknowns going into 2025. What's the biggest one among them that you're looking to get an answer on once we get into this season?
I mean, there's a lot with them, but I think to try to keep it as concise as possible, can they take another step forward despite no technical alliance? You look at that team, and they're one of the few proud undercards that do not want to, and they've publicly said, we do not desire a public alliance with anyone. Like we don't want a technical alliance. They've said that publicly. And so it's one of those of, can they legitimately take that next step? Do they feel like they really have the framework of things in play? There's been a lot of change, new driver lineups. Canapino's gone. Connor has found himself going from pushing them into leader circle with their best ever finish, a podium in Milwaukee, to what is at the moment a full-time gig that is now potentially in flux. And David O'Neill now has kind of full reign as team principal of this program. And I'm very fascinated to see if they can take that next step. Do they, let's not forget, Connor was great at Milwaukee, and there was a lot of great finishes, Grosjean at Laguna, right? Like there were some good results for this team. But let's not forget, until the final pit stop, Agustin Canapino, who is an oval novice by every stretch, was literally running sixth in the Indianapolis 500.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care how they finish the rest of the season. If they go out and show up and show out at the Indy 500, technical alliances be damned. That's a win. That's the best result any team can hope for, right? Short of a championship. So I'm fascinated to see if they can just stay the course and take that next step while staying the course. because everyone in this era of IndyCar, and you and I both have known this for a minute, everyone's trying to build an alliance with somebody because they think that's the way, that's the hierarchy. If everyone has an alliance, how do you actually gain an advantage? So I look at them as kind of in the catbird seat as the most likely takers to gain an advantage.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And the last one on our list, Dale Coyne Racing. It's almost tough to think of one question. I think I'm glad that we got the question answered of who their driver lineup is for the full season. We didn't get that until down the stretch when we learned that Catherine Legg was going to close out the year in the on the ovals to end last season. So it's good to see that team to have a little bit more solid footing. I think the biggest question in my mind is, can this team build on, create some stability and build off of 2025 going into 2026? Can they, I know maybe this isn't exactly where Rinus wants to be long term, given some of the flashes of speed and success that he showed at ECR. It would seem like this would be a good place for Jacob Abel to spend a couple seasons to get his feet wet in IndyCar. But I think the best thing for this team is to, as they have bled engineering talent over the last 5 years or so, that's really kind of taken a toll on what their ultimate performances could be and what their ceiling was. Can they just have some stability and have something that they can build off year over year, where they're not replacing David Malukas, they're not replacing Takuma Sato, Romain Grosjean, Alex Palou, Santino Ferrucci, the list goes on and on and on. I think that's something that every team in this series craves, but particularly those that are kind of at the bottom. I think that's the way that you improve, is having the ability to build on one season into the next with the same drivers and the same engineers, and not just be constantly starting from square one. That's kind of what we've seen with AJ Foyt Racing. The way in which they have gone from constantly being at the bottom of the sport, and every single year you and I writing stories on this is the season that the AJ Foyt Racing is going to finally turn a page, and they're turning over a new leaf as they were constantly rotating drivers in and out. They've finally built some stability, at least with Santino Ferrucci, and look what it turned into last year. So I'd love nothing more for that team than to have their driver lineup set by October next year, if we find out that Rinus and Jacob are sticking around for 2026.
Yeah, I mean, I echo a similar sentiment. I think that when I look at the landscape of the series at large, is there really anywhere for Rinus to go in 2026?
Yeah.
I mean, because I look at it, and maybe this is a negative outlook. I don't know, or pessimistic at best. But barring a Marcus Ericsson down year, I don't see anywhere he goes. Like anywhere else he can go, because I mean, that when you're talking about like him Rinus having a great year and being able to propel to one of the big four, that's it in my opinion.
And I'll say this real quickly. Now I know that and maybe your reporting is different on this than mine, but I've been told unequivocally by Rob Edwards that lineup is intact through the end of 2026 there at Andretti. So that might not even be an option for him.
100%. And so, that's why I look at that and I'm like, he's got no choice but to build a home at Dale Coyne Racing. And I think that's good for both parties, because one, he just underwent 5 years and then just surprisingly got tossed to the curb. Surprised all of us. I think there's a point to prove for both. And I know Dale has got a lot of infrastructure within that organization, and he's usually plucked from, most of his engineers end up going to Chip Ganassi, Penske, et cetera. And unfortunately, they're always the easy team to pick on as, you're the last team on the grid. Well, yeah, but their roster fills most of the grid. Mm-hmm. Fair.
It's this training ground for a lot of great people in the sport.
It would be great to see them have a good year on a number of levels. I think Jacob, to your point, having a good home there, because we see where with the charter agreement and the situation in play, Able Motorsports is not going to probably promote themselves on a regular basis from Indy Next to IndyCar. So this is a great training ground for him. And equally, I think it's good for Renus. I think the only thing that I'm kind of wondering in the back of my mind, and I think you were the one that brought this point up to me in one of our casual conversations, is, and I don't know if this is per charter agreement or if this is just a new development, but the fact that you can only have 3 drivers per entry for the season from here on out. And if that's the case, it makes sense why, and it's also kind of regretful. We're not going to get the fun rotation, the fun flux of the Toby Soweries and the Catherine Leggs and just the healthy blend of different entries to just kind of showcase their talents for random events. So,
yeah.
But I think for that organization, stability is key.
Yeah, agreed. Well, those are our 11 full-time teams in the sport. Fun conversation. Let us know what your biggest questions are for those each, for any or all of those teams. If you differ with us, you can leave them in the comments as you listen to this episode and others on Apple and Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. Feel free to send Joey and I comments or DMs on Twitter, on X, whatever you want to call it, on social media. Let us know some thoughts on the podcast. Obviously, we're 2 episodes in. We're taping this here the week before things really truly get rolling here in St. Pete. We're really excited for what the season is going to bring for IndyCar at large, but especially for this podcast platform at the Inside Line, and turning it into a podcast product that can bring something a little bit different, that has 2 folks that are really embedded in this sport from a journalist standpoint, who are really keyed in on what's going on track and off the track, and hopefully can help you guys understand a little bit better the sport that we all know and love and spend gobs of time talking about, writing about, thinking about, and following. So our next episode I believe we'll record hopefully Monday after St. Pete. There'll be a lot to talk about. Probably be a podcast of things to talk about, just from bullpen interviews with drivers, not to mention how things shake out once we actually get to see these cars and these teams and these drivers on track, with many of them with new organizations and new homes, and see how the hierarchy actually shakes out once we get to see how results go. Joey, before we finish this up, any one thing you're looking forward to or expecting or excited to see once we get to St. Pete?
I think the adaptation of the hybrid is going to be massively key. I mean, I think that we haven't seen it at the Speedway outside of the test, and it was selective with who was there, to be fair. It wasn't like all 33 potential entries are there. So, I think that the hybrid adaptation is going to be massively key. And that's part of the reason why I think this is going to be such a diverse season, because I think different weekends are going to provide different masteries.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's it for this week's edition of The Inside Line. I'm Nathan Brown, Motorsports Insider with the Indianapolis Star. Thanks again to my co-host, Joey Barnes. We'll see you guys next time on next week's episode of The Inside Line.